China has identified the cause of the
mysterious new virus.
Coronavirus.
There are fears a rapidly spreading virus has reached Australia.
This is a rapidly emerging situation.
Where there are cases, the government can quickly implement targeted measures and focus control efforts where they're needed most.
Together in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies,
we need vaccines to immunize ourselves.
And then the final solution, which is a year to 2 years off, is the vaccine.
The answer to that is to really close things down.
Hello again, and welcome back to The Abstract. I am your host, Peter Kirby, author of the book Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project, and staff writer at Activist Post. Today we're going to go with the old chemtrail research. This is a paper I've been working on for really probably about a year and a half. There was a certain book that I was holding out to get my hands on it, but then of course nothing ended up being in that book. But anyway, I've been able to put together, it's kind of like an investigation of investigations. Really, this post-war development of the New Manhattan Project is really a culmination of papers that I've been writing since my book came out in mid-2020, and it kind of ties together these different things like the Rand Corporation and the Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratories and Textron and things. So, what I'm deducing from all of this is that it boils down to the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board. LBJ had a lot to do with it, and as we're about to get into, this other guy named Robert Lovett has roots of the New Manhattan Project going back to World War I and earlier. So I hope you enjoy this, the results of this investigation, and let's get to it. So today we're going to talk about the post-war development of the New Manhattan Project. The decades immediately following the conclusion of World War II were very important to the formation of today's global weather modification project the author refers to as the New Manhattan Project, and the chemtrails that we see in the sky so often are part of this global weather modification project. And the post-war development of it all started largely with something called the von Karman reports, and these reports strongly suggested the formation of something called the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, which, as we will see, the evidence indicates that the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, also known as the SAB, has been instrumental in the production of the New Manhattan Project. Also, we're going to look at the life of Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett. I believe his career is highly applicable to the New Manhattan Project. And we're also going to look, as part of our investigation into the SAB, we're going to look at General Bernard Schriever. And in the last section, we're going to take a look at President Lyndon Johnson's connections to all of this. And as we go along, of course, many other individuals and organizations will be talked about. If you would like a foundational knowledge as to all of what we're talking about here today, I highly suggest reading my book, Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project. So let us launch now into the story of the post-war development of the biggest scientific effort in history. Our first section here in the paper that is currently up and running on Activist Post is about Robert Lovett and the Eastern Establishment. To understand today's New Manhattan Project, and specifically the origins of the Flying Tigers, which the evidence indicates eventually became today's proprietary fleet of aircraft spraying us with chemtrails. I think to understand all of this, we really need to take a look at the career of Robert A. Lovett. His life goes back to before World War I, and as a young man, he was involved in World War I. He invented this notion of strategic bombing. This was using aircraft for offensive purposes, and we're going to talk about all of that. Robert Lovett was a skull and bonesman. He was a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman. He was the Undersecretary of State. He was these are all at different times, the Secretary of Defense, a trustee of both the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, and a life member emeritus of the corporation of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, readers of my work know that all of those organizations that I just mentioned are heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project. So that's just a teaser as to his whole story here, which I find fascinating. Robert Abercrombie Lovett was born in 1895 in Huntsville, Texas, and we're going to be getting back to Texas, specifically with LBJ and his good old boys. But Lovett's father, Robert Scott Lovett, was the chair of the War Industries Board during World War I, and Lovett's father was a close business associate of E.H. Harriman, and the younger Lovett was a close childhood friend of E.H. Harriman's son, Roland Bunny Harriman. Both the younger Lovett and Bunny Harriman entered Yale in 1913. Lovett and his Yale classmate Frederick Truby Davison formed a group of pilots known as the Yale Aero Club, and they were going about trying to fly aircraft in support of the American World War I military campaign, and they formed a group of 9 at Yale. There was financing from Davison's father, who was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan. Now, he funded initially, Davison's father initially funded a summer of flying instruction, but we see from the get-go this combination of Wall Street and military, right? We're talking, Lovett's career on Wall Street is just legendary. And, of course, he's tied in with the Harrimans and the J.P. Morgans and all this stuff. And here they are funding what largely amounts to a paramilitary group during World War I. And this is, the roots of American aviation. The Wright brothers had not very long ago just invented this whole field. It was a very nascent time in aviation around World War I and the years leading up to World War I. So from the beginning, the elites of this world, Wall Street, the banksters, they've been very interested in air power, and Lovett was their man from early on. And so Davison, who was working with Lovett at the Yale Aero Club, he was able to get the ear of a Navy Air Corps lieutenant by the name of John H. Towers, and Towers encouraged the members of this Yale Aero unit to enlist in the Naval Reserve, and this became a story in the press, and the members of the Yale Aero Club were dubbed the Millionaires Unit by the press, and these 9 were soon off to Palm Beach, Florida. I think they were actually gaining members at this point, so it might have been more than 9 when they went off to Palm Beach, Florida for formal military training. As we will see, it ended up being 27, but they were getting a lot of special treatment and special funding. You can bet that Davison's father was not the only one providing funding to all of this. But there were also three members of this Yale Aero Club, also known as the Millionaires Unit. They already belonged to Skull and Bones. So they trained in Palm Beach, Florida, and then they went north again to Long Island, New York, where the Navy had secured 75 acres, including 1,400 feet of shorefront, and a fine mansion for the young men. There were hangars, runways, a radio shed, a machine shop, and docks constructed. 2 new seaplanes were provided by the Navy. and a third was privately furnished by Harry Payne Whitney, who was a famous guy. Apparently the Whitney family is famous on the East Coast, or not so famous on the West Coast, but anyway, yeah, so you see the Navy funding all of this with special funding, and here's more elites coming in, Harry Payne Whitney, and so all the money's pouring into this millionaires unit. And I think this has tremendous amounts to do with the later formation of the Flying Tigers, and I'll continue here. In 1917, all members of the millionaires unit, with the exception of Davison, passed their Navy flying examinations. Davison had been injured in a crash. And then, so there were 27 of members of the millionaires unit by this point, and only 2 of them actually went on to Europe. The other 25 stayed in America to promote recruitment at a lot of newly created training stations throughout the country. But Lovett and his friend Artemus Dye Gates, I guess they called him Dye, that was his nickname, Lovett and Gates, they went to France. So Lovett first went to an American naval air station at Mount Chic near Bordeaux in the south of France. He also trained on the French Riviera, and he was working on the grounds of these bases. And then he was sent to Royal Navy Air Base on the North Sea, where he hooked up again with one of his former Yale classmates, John Voorhees, as well as a guy by the name of Al Sturtevant. And as he was serving with the British, Lovett flew his first missions as an escort for convoys and as a patrol searching for German submarines. And at this time, he was getting ideas about how to revamp the Navy's European air operations. In 1918, Lovett was sent to Paris, and he was under Captain Hutch I. Cone. He was serving as Cone's assistant. Cone was the chief of U.S. naval aviation in Europe at the time. And briefly, Lovett was left in full charge of all American naval air operations in Europe when Cone went on an inspection tour. And then Lovett was transferred to northern France, and this is where he brought his new theories of aerial warfare to fruition. Lovett was successfully bombing German submarines, and he began promoting the idea of what he called strategic bombing. Now, this was a new strategic bombing involved loading up your plane with bombs and offensively going to enemy target positions and dropping bombs on those targets. See, previously, airplanes had only been used in support of ground and sea operations, and yeah, they would have the dogfights, where they would, where enemy planes would show up and then they would fight each other and stuff. But the idea of using aircraft specifically for offensive bombing had not come to fruition at that point. It was Lovett who brought that forward, and so Lovett was doing this successfully, and he lobbied Captain Cone to create a group that was to specifically conduct these type of operations, and Cone assented, and the Northern Bombing Group was created. Now, this Northern Bombing Group was based near Dunkirk. I think that's in Belgium, if I'm not mistaken. It's right across the English Channel from England. It's on mainland Europe. And so this Northern Bombing Group was there in Dunkirk, and there was nearly 300 airplanes and some 3,100 enlisted men needed to maintain them. So this was quite a big operation. The captain of it was a guy by the name of David Hanrahan. He was the commander of the Northern Bombing Group, and Lovett was named commander of the Night Bomber Wing, as well as the commander of the 1st Squadron. And it was at that time that Lovett went about gathering his old Yale Aero unit buddies. He was happy to report that he had gotten together, quote, all the old crowd. So he got his buddies together there in the Northern Bombing Group over there in Europe. A lot of them went over there, And late in the summer of 1918, Lovett had nearly 1,500 men under his direct command. Of course, they weren't, all from Yale, because there was only like 27 at the most of the Yale Aero Club, but there was a significant number of guys from the Yale Aero Club in this northern bombing group. But Lovett had 1,500 men under his command. Lovett was only 22 years old at the time, but he had all this, military power at his disposal, and he had revolutionized at that point the role of aircraft in warfare. So he had thus revolutionized warfare itself. And the Northern Bombing Group conducted many successful bombing raids of German submarines and I believe other targets as well. And Lovett's official rank became a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve Force. Following the conclusion of World War I in late 1918, Lovett came home to America early in the following year, January of 1919. He collected his college degree from Yale, married his wife Adele. They had a daughter named Evelyn in 1920. Later in that year, Robert went to Harvard, where he studied law, and he also entered Harvard's Graduate School of Business Administration. That's where the whiz kids came from. We're going to be talking about them. And then after that, he became a clerk first at the National Bank of Commerce in New York City, and then he became a clerk at Brown Brothers, where he was to stay for the rest of his life. And it was at Brown Brothers where his father-in-law was already a senior partner. So that works. That's convenient for Lovett. But like I said, he was born into all this. That was inevitable. And then in 1926, Lovett became a partner at Brown Brothers, and he was specializing in overseas banking, just like Prescott Bush, the Nazi banker. Let us continue. In 1927, Lovett had a son, which he also named Robert. Or his dad was named Robert, he was named Robert, and he had a son named Robert. They all have different middle names, apparently. And this Yale unit that we were just talking about, they continued to meet at an annual dinner. So they stayed together over the years. They were probably all talking about, air power, European air power, American air power. I mean, it was the cutting edge of militaries at the time. It was the most important thing, because when you control the skies, you really control everything, such as readers of my work already know. And so Lovett had been a longtime childhood friend of Roland Bunny Harriman, but over the years he also became friends with Roland's older brother Averell Harriman, one of the wise men, as we will talk about soon. And Lovett encouraged this merger between Brown Brothers, where he was working, and the Harriman Company to become Brown Brothers Harriman. And Lovett was right in the middle of that. And, this Brown Brothers Harriman, of course, is the Bush family bank. And readers of my work know that the Bush family is heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project. There were quite a few executives at Brown Brothers Harriman who were also members of Skull and Bones, including Prescott Bush, Knight Woolley, Roland Harriman, Ellery James, and Bob Lovett. In the years immediately preceding America's involvement in World War II, Lovett went on a personal inspection tour of the American aviation industry in order to understand how ready America was for war. It was obvious that America was going to have to enter the war in Europe in World War II, and so Lovett was concerned about, how ready are we to produce all these planes and all these munitions and everything that we're going to need to invade Europe at some point in support of the Allies. And what he found was that America was far behind Germany in these capacities. And so he contacted the Undersecretary of the Navy, his buddy James Forrestal. Of course, Forrestal had just recently left Wall Street as well. But Forrestal put Lovett in contact with Robert Patterson, who was the assistant to the Secretary of War. And Robert Patterson hooked up a meeting with Lovett and the Secretary of War, Henry L. Skull and Bones Stimson. And in late 1940, President Roosevelt made Lovett and another guy by the name of John McCloy special assistants to the Secretary of War, Stimson. And Stimson referred to McCloy and Lovett as his heavenly twins. There was also a third such assistant by the name of Harvey H. Bundy, who also happened to be a Skull and Bonesman. And the Bundy name is one of the Illuminati bloodlines. Just thought I'd mention that. But, with all this high-level mucking about, Lovett was getting some good press. And in fact, he was really friendly with all the people in the mainstream media at the time. By February of 1941, journalist Joseph Alsop was praising Lovett in his column. Alsop was a big supporter of the Flying Tigers as well, wrote glowingly of the Flying Tigers in the early 1940s. And Lovett was really friends with all these people in the mainstream media at the time. He was friends with Henry Luce, the Time magazine publisher, Henry Luce was Skull and Bones. And he was friends with, him and his wife were friends with the Grahams of the Washington Post. Lovett himself served on the board of the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, for many years. And Lovett was close with Eugene Meyer, the owner of the Washington Post, and Meyer gave Lovett a series of parties to introduce the Lovetts to Washington when they came. And he was really close with his old Yale buddy Charles Murs, who was the editorial director of the New York Times. It was during this time when Lovett was an assistant to Secretary of War Stimson that he became aware of a young bureaucrat in the Department of the Interior named Charles B. Tex Thornton, commonly known as simply Tex Thornton. And Lovett persuaded Tex to join the Army Air Corps. And Lovett got Thornton a commission as a second lieutenant. And Thornton ended up being one of Lovett's closest collaborators. And now we're getting into what I've already written about in my article, Tex Thornton and the New Manhattan Project. It has to do with Tex Thornton, the Whiz Kids, Ford Motors, Hughes Aerospace, and Litton Industries. So that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. If you want to look into all that, I encourage you to do so. But just for the sake of our discussion here, Tex Thornton and his Whiz Kids were working with Lovett to increase America's air war-making capabilities. And as Lovett became Assistant Secretary of War for Air, he was in a position to ensure the production of an adequate number of aircraft and to streamline the Army Air Force's bureaucracy. And he relied upon Tex Thornton and his Whiz Kids to do all of the heavy lifting here. And it worked out just great. In 1938, the Army Air Corps had 1,773 planes and had trained 500 pilots. In 1942, after Tex Thornton, Robert Lovett, and the Whiz Kids had gone to work, the Army Air Corps had built 47,000 new planes and trained 30,000 pilots. So, Lovett, the Whiz Kids, and Tex Thornton, they got America ready for war in World War II, the air war specifically. And following the war, Lovett went back to Brown Brothers Harriman as a full partner. And in mid-1947, Lovett left Brown Brothers Harriman once again and became the Undersecretary of State. And as George C. Marshall's Undersecretary of State, Lovett was instrumental in the implementation of the post-war Marshall Plan, the Rebuilding of Europe plan, and Lovett was instrumental in the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is implicated in the New Manhattan Project, of course. And the Lovetts dined occasionally at the home of Central Intelligence Agency man Frank Wisner. There's quite a bit about Wisner in my book. Wisner was the guy who formally accepted the surrender of Nazi General Reinhard Gehlen, and then he went on to secure American visas for Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists. And these type of scientists, former Nazis, are heavily implicated in the new Manhattan Project. Wisner had a lot to do as well with the formation of the CIA proprietary airline Civil Air Transport. This is another airline in the lineage of airlines that I think eventually became the new Manhattan Project, the evidence strongly indicates. And but even more pertinently, as I mentioned in my book, Frank Wisner Jr. was the acting Secretary of State when the large-scale domestic spraying operations began in 1996. And Lovett was tight with Wisner. In early 1949, Lovett resigned from his position as acting Secretary of State, and Lovett headed back to, guess what, his partnership at Brown Brothers Harriman. And then in 1951, he left BBH once again to become the 4th U.S. Secretary of Defense. And then in 1953, he resigned from that position and went back to Brown Brothers Harriman. Note this revolving door between Brown Brothers Harriman and the Air Force, what eventually became the Air Force. I find that very interesting. I mean, you could expand that even more and say a revolving door between the Defense Department and Wall Street. The Defense Department and Wall Street. I mean, all these guys. I mean, Lovett wasn't the only one. And just to give you an idea of how powerful, how influential Lovett was at the height of his power, when JFK became president, Kennedy became president, he offered Lovett his choice of 3 positions. He said, you can be the head of the Department of State, the Department of Defense, or the Department of the Treasury. Lovett turned all 3 down. He just wanted to stay at Brown Brothers Harriman. But Lovett suggested to Kennedy the 3 men who ended up in those 3 positions. So as we can see, Lovett had a lasting impact on the Defense Department. And you can also specifically point to this one episode where Eisenhower had set up something called the President's Advisory Committee on Government Organization. This was commonly known as the Rockefeller Committee. And of course, Rockefellers are all up in the new Manhattan Project, the evidence strongly indicates. And there was a certain plan produced by this Rockefeller Committee called Plan Number 6, and this drew heavily on proposals left by Robert Lovett. This Plan Number 6 went into effect in the Department of Defense on June 30th, 1953, and it abolished various boards. It transferred their duties to the Secretary of Defense. It authorized the Secretary of Defense to name a general counsel and 8 assistant secretaries. So, you can point to specific, there's all kinds of things that Lovett did to remodel the Defense Department. One of Robert Lovett's children, Robin Lovett, I think it was a guy. It's spelled R-O-B-I-N, could be a woman, but I think it was a guy, Robin Lovett. But he graduated from Yale in 1949. He had a degree in electrical engineering, which is highly applicable to the new Manhattan Project. And he went on to get his master's degree in science from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which, the evidence indicates is central to the new Manhattan Project. And Robin also went to work for the DuPont Corporation of Wilmington, Delaware, and they're implicated in the new Manhattan Project. Robert Lovett continued at Brown Brothers Harriman until the day he died. In 1983, at the age of 88, he was transferred to the status of a limited partner in the firm. They were kind of putting him out to pasture, and then he died 3 years later, in 1986. But, this post-war development of the new Manhattan Project and the roots of all of this was something much bigger than just one man. And Lovett had a whole cohort of associates. These were commonly known as the wise men. And they were products of the Eastern establishment, and they circulated within the Eastern establishment. And presidents from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Nixon consulted them. That's quite a span. You got FDR, you got Truman, you got Eisenhower, You got Kennedy, you got Johnson, and then Nixon. So that's quite a span of time from FDR to Nixon. The wise men were consulted, and it's a little bit sketchy as to exactly who these wise men were. But I have two books that write about them. Robert Lovett's biography, and then there was another book on that subject written by Isaacson called The Wise Men. And if you combine the names that both of those authors come up with, you get this list here of Lovett, John McCloy, the aforementioned Lovett and McCloy, and then William Averill Harriman, Dean Acheson, George Frost Keenan, Charles Eustace Bolin, also known as Chip Bolin, Eugene Black, Arthur Dean, Paul Hoffman, Roswell Gilpatrick, and James J. Wadsworth. All right, next section, the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board. One of the most important organizations to the post-war development of the New Manhattan Project is the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, also known as the Scientific Advisory Board, or the SAB. Now, this was created in 1946 in accordance with the von Karman reports, the aforementioned von Karman reports. These were von Karman reports estimated the state of American military capabilities and suggested paths forward with an emphasis upon new technologies. And the von Karman reports specifically outlined and mandated and suggested that new methods of controlling the weather should be brought into existence. So the SAB was created out of the mandates listed in the von Karman reports, and part of that was new ways to control the weather. And so I've written and spoken quite a bit about the exploits of the famous scientists from General Electric, Langmuir, Schaefer, and Vonnegut. And I do continue to believe, and the evidence strongly indicates, that they did have a significant and lasting impact upon the production of the New Manhattan Project. But I think at a deeper and larger level, it was more about the Scientific Advisory Board and the organizations that were working for them. Vonnegut specifically went on to do a lot of important work, but as far as a more comprehensive development of the New Manhattan Project is concerned, I think it's all about the SAB, the Scientific Advisory Board. And there was one person in particular who worked closely with the Scientific Advisory Board. This was a guy by the name of General Bernard Schriever. He didn't work for them, but he worked for a group that fed them scientists. And although I have no direct evidence of Schriever feeding former Nazi scientists into the projects that the SAB was producing, the evidence does strongly indicate that was the case, because Schriever was working closely with Lieutenant General Donald Putt, who I write about in my book quite a bit. And Putt was an open Nazi lover. He was doing everything he could to get the Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists into the American military-industrial complex. And Schriever also worked with Frank Wisner, the aforementioned Frank Wisner. And, being that the history of the New Manhattan Project is riddled with former Nazi scientists, and Schriever was working with these guys who were working with the former Nazi scientists, the evidence strongly indicates that Schriever was feeding former Nazi scientists into projects that the SAB was producing. And he's mostly well known. Schriever is most well known for his production of the intercontinental ballistic missile. But I think there's a lot more going on here that's pertinent to our investigation. So Schriever was born in Germany. He was a German speaker. He was bilingual. When you heard him speak English, you wouldn't think that he spoke any other language besides English. He sounds like a Texan, born and bred. But he actually came to America as a young boy. He was born in Germany. And Schriever eventually became the recipient of General Henry H. Hap Arnold's legacy. Now, if you know about Hap Arnold, he was probably the highest ranking guy in the military, or at least the Air Force, who was the Army Air Force, who was bringing forward new technologies. That was his big thing. He was always on the cutting edge of technology and trying to bring more in. And it was Schriever who inherited his legacy. And Schriever and Arnold became acquainted with each other in 1933. And Arnold served as a mentor and friend to young Schriever for the rest of his life, for the rest of Arnold's life. And during World War II, under the remote guidance of Arnold, Schriever became a full colonel in the Army Air Force. And after the end of the war, in order to promote science within the Air Force, it was Arnold that ordered the formation of a new scientific liaison branch. This was the branch that Schriever headed. Arnold ordered the formation of it, and Schriever headed it, this scientific liaison branch. This was the organization that was feeding scientists into SAB projects. And this scientific liaison branch existed within something called the Air Force Research and Engineering Division. And it is documented that Schriever was providing employment opportunities for the former scientists of MIT's Wartime Radiation Laboratory. And I have plenty of stuff in my book about MIT's Wartime Radiation Laboratory. They're connected to the New Manhattan Project extensively. And so Schriever's running this scientific liaison branch, providing employment opportunities for scientists. And he's not only doing that, but he's also promoting science generally within the military. This was what Arnold wanted Schriever to continue to do after Arnold's passing. Arnold died shortly after World War II. He might have even died right before end of World War II. But anyway, let me see here. Oh yeah, Hap Arnold died in 1950, so 5 years after World War II ended. But Schriever continued Arnold's legacy. And Schriever also later fed scientists into another organization implicated in the New Manhattan Project known as the Air Research and Development Command. So Schriever was working with a lot of people implicated in the New Manhattan Project, not only what we just went over, but during World War II, Schriever was serving under General George Kenney. I have a quote in my book where Kenney's talking about whoever controls the movement of air masses controls the world. Schriever was working with Teddy Wolkowitz and Lawrence Rockefeller. There's just too much there for me to even go into. It's all in my book. But again, the Rockefeller name, all up in the New Manhattan Project. And then Schriever was working quite a bit at Wright Field, the then Wright Field. Today is known as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and Wright-Patterson is heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project. You hear how I stress heavily. And one of Benny's study groups, one of Schriever's study groups, eventually produced, or they produced, the study that went on to cause the manufacture of this aircraft, the Lockheed C-141 Starlifter. Now, this is a plane that has been spotted by expert spotters spraying chemtrails. I know they came into existence a long time ago, but the evidence suggests that they've been refurbished and used as proprietary chemtrail sprayers. All that whole story is in my book. But yeah, there's lots of little odds and ends that tie Schriever to the New Manhattan Project. And then there's also lots of other things that tie the SAB to the New Manhattan Project. There was an organization that basically worked for the SAB. It's called the Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratory. And the SAB would direct the Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratory to produce equipment. And it was their lab. It was like their proprietary lab. And a lot of the stuff that the Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratory produced is highly pertinent to the New Manhattan Project. In fact, they produced, as far as I can tell, just about every technology you might need to run the New Manhattan Project, maybe besides the computing power. And so if people want to go look back and see the article I wrote about the Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratories. I encourage you to do so. It's called the Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratories and the New Manhattan Project. Also, the SAB is implicated in the New Manhattan Project by their relationship with the RAND Corporation. I have also written an article about how the RAND Corporation is heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project. The RAND Corporation would come up with things. They were like a think tank. And they would come up with ideas, and then they would tell the SAB which of these ideas they thought should be brought into fruition. And so basically the RAND Corporation was directing the SAB to produce different things, or at least suggesting the production of different things. So I highly recommend that the listener check out my previous article on this topic, the RAND Corporation and the New Manhattan Project. And also, the SAB had as members both Edward Teller and John von Neumann. There's way too much information again in my book. Yeah, I go on and on. There's paragraph after paragraph after both, on both Teller and von Neumann. And so, if you want further details of that, as well as more information about the SAB itself, please refer to the author's book. And the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board still exists today. They have a website. Here it is. And I just started poking around on it, and I said to myself, oh no, there's just too much here. Like, this is another paper entirely. So, if you want to go down that rabbit hole and play along at home, please, I encourage you to do so. But, this may be the subject of the SAB is probably going to be the subject of another paper. I'm just going to look into them specifically, do a deep dive into just the SAB, and I bet I find a whole lot. I always do. I don't know how that works. But now we come to the final section, LBJ and the good old boys. I like this quote from Johnson. I do understand power. Whatever else may be said about me, I know where to look for it and how to use it. I think you can describe Lyndon Johnson in a lot of words. The words that I would choose would be audacious, grandiose, vain, racist, crude, sexist, lecherous, brilliant, bully, greedy, tenacious, a political animal. Former United States President Lyndon Baines Johnson was not the kind of guy to let an opportunity like the production of the biggest scientific effort in history slip by. And in fact, the evidence indicates that he was all in. Many times he advocated for global weather control. He ran with many people implicated in the New Manhattan Project, and as we will see, Texas, where he was from, was a hotbed of NMP activity. The evidence indicates that Lyndon Johnson and his cronies were instrumental in the post-war development of the New Manhattan Project. I think it's important to note that Johnson was owned by the largest construction company in the world at the time, something called Brown and Root. And this company mostly worked on, if not totally, worked on government contracts. They would do the biggest type of productions that anybody would be doing. They built things bigger than nobody else could build. And they worked with the military a lot, so they would, understand how to keep things secret through compartmentalization. So I think they were just the type of organizations, and specifically because of their connections to LBJ and all his connections to the New Manhattan Project. I'm really looking at Brown and Root as a contractor for the large-scale operations needed for the post-war development of the New Manhattan Project. They were into dam building, rural electrification, shipbuilding, oil pipelines, just big construction projects, and they were perennially chosen by the government to do the job. They had all kinds of connections in the government to get these things done. And I like this one passage from Robert Caro, Johnson's most well-known biographer. I think he pretty much encapsulates what the relationship was between Brown and Root and LBJ. Caro writes, quote, "Brown and Root became, thanks to Johnson, an industrial colossus, one of the largest construction companies and shipbuilding companies and oil pipeline companies in the world, holder of Johnson-arranged government contracts and receiver of Johnson-arranged government favors amounting to billions of dollars. Suave George Brown and his fierce brother Herman became, in return, the principal financiers of Johnson's rise to national power." In early 1940, Brown and Root, as an example, was given a de facto exclusive on Navy contracts awarded in Texas. LBJ was known as Roosevelt's man in Texas, and he was to be necessarily consulted in these matters. Subsequently, the $100 million Corpus Christi Naval Air Station was given to Brown and Root with a no-bid contract. Congressional funding was fast-tracked, and the Undersecretary of the Navy, the aforementioned James Forrestal, went far out of his way to make sure that the job remained in the hands of Brown and Root. There's also a tie-in here to our friend Robert Lovett. Robert Lovett facilitated the creation of Del Val Army Air Base east of Austin. Of course, LBJ's name figured prominently in the building of this base. A major aspect of Brown and Root's business was the production of hydroelectric power generating dams. Now, this is a direct tie-in to the New Manhattan Project because weather modification activities have traditionally been conducted in order to put more water in those reservoirs behind those dams that generate so much power. And so, when you can fill up a reservoir behind a hydroelectric power generating dam, you can generate a lot of money. And so I find it interesting that was a major aspect of Brown and Root's business right there. And so as we look at Brown and Root today, they were acquired by Halliburton somewhere along the line. I think it was before the Vietnam War, because during the Vietnam War, Halliburton and their subsidiary Brown and Root was one of three contractors that were responsible for 90% of the construction contracts in Vietnam during the war, a war greatly enabled by Johnson. And this Textron company is implicated in all of this as well. There's a division of the Textron company called Bell Helicopters. Now see, Bell Helicopters, they produced the famous Bell helicopter, and they were prolific contributors to LBJ's political campaigns. Before they were acquired by Textron, the Johnsons made a killing on Bell's stock when Bell was given massive contracts for the production of helicopters used during the Vietnam War, a war that Johnson basically enabled. And, LBJ used to fly around Texas making campaign stops. This was long before the Vietnam War, but he was very close with Bell Helicopter, and Bell Helicopter was eventually acquired by Textron. And Textron is strongly implicated in the New Manhattan Project. I've already written an article about this. It's called Textron and the New Manhattan Project. So we have all of that already. But then when you start considering Johnson's pervasive involvement in America's early space programs, then you start to really see Johnson's implications for the New Manhattan Project. He He was basically advocating for the New Manhattan Project long before the New Manhattan Project came into existence. Now, this quote is in my book already, but I just find it so relevant to what we're talking about, and I think I should read this paragraph from Johnson. Johnson said this. He said, "The testimony of the scientists is this. Control of space means control of the world. Far more certainly, far more totally than any control that has ever or could ever be achieved by weapons or by troops of occupation. From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. If, out in space, there is the ultimate position from which total control of the earth may be exercised, then our national goal and the goal of all free men must be to win and hold that position." Now, does that sound like the New Manhattan Project to you? Sure does to me. After World War II, Johnson was appointed to both the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy and the House Select Committee on Post-War Military Policy. Now, readers of my work know that the term atomic energy in government speak often means weather control, and the post-war military policy that plays directly into the New Manhattan Project. So Johnson was right there at the positions of power needed to bring forward the New Manhattan Project right after the war. As I write in my book, LBJ was the driving political force behind the 1958 creation of NASA, and in 1961, President Kennedy put Johnson in charge of his 9-member National Space Council, which was an advisory body for America's space program. So there he was at the top of the bureaucracy for the implementation of an American space program. Johnson, on Kennedy's National Space Council. Other members of the National Space Council included James E. Webb, Dean Rusk, WizKid, Robert McNamara, and Glenn Seaborg. As I write in my book, it was around that time that Glenn Seaborg was promoting the idea of planetary engineering, which is, of course, synonymous with today's geoengineering. It was the earlier term that was used to describe geoengineering, planetary engineering. Glenn Seaborg, sitting on the National Space Council, chaired by Johnson. Many individuals heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project are from Texas and or knew LBJ well. Vice Admiral William Raborn was from Texas. Raborn has a whole chapter in my book. Raborn was briefly the head of the CIA under Johnson, and he was head of the CIA at the time that the infamous Restoring the Quality of Our Environment document came out in 1965. I call that document Wrecking the Quality of Our Environment. It has everything to do with the New Manhattan Project. And 2 years earlier, in 1963, Raborn's article about how electromagnetic energy can be used to control the weather had been published. Now, this document, Restoring the Quality of Our Environment, was a product of LBJ's Environmental Pollution Panel of the President's Science Advisory Committee. LBJ's buddy in Texas, David Harold Byrd, was making money in the Texas aerospace industry. This is all in my book. He had fortuitously formed a company for aerospace ground support a couple years before NASA came into existence. A couple years before his buddy caused NASA to come into existence. And the aforementioned Tex Thornton was from, guess where, Texas, oddly enough. Robert Lovett, as I mentioned, was born in Texas. General Bernard Schriever was raised in Texas, San Antonio to be specific. That's where he was brought after he was born in Germany. And it doesn't stop there. Our BFF, Gordon J.F. How to Wreck the Environment MacDonald, was LBJ's science advisor. Harlan Cleveland, who has a whole section in my book, was President Johnson's Assistant Secretary of State. Tommy the Cork Corcoran, that was FDR's right-hand man, was a big Johnson ally, and that Tommy the Cork Corcoran has a lot to do with the founding of the Flying Tigers in the early 1940s. It's all in my book. And also, in the 1930s, at least, the Rockefellers had a stranglehold on the production of oil in Texas. So the Rockefellers were huge in Texas, and the Rockefeller name is just... It just goes on and on about the Rockefellers implicated in the New Manhattan Project. It's all in my book. General Electric, another organization heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project, spent big money on advertisements on LBJ's radio station, KTBC. And we have also General Curtis LeMay, the Mad General. He was head of the Rand Corporation, the aforementioned Rand Corporation. And General Curtis LeMay was close with Johnson's inner circle. Also, Johnson was one of the earliest congressional overseers of the CIA. So, it helps to have friendlies overseeing you. I mean, these were the people that Johnson ran with, CIA types, up one side and down the other. And there he is, one of the earliest congressional so-called overseers of the CIA, but that gave Johnson much more access to and contacts within the agency. So it did nothing but make him closer to the CIA. And as I write in my book, CIA has probably been basically the omnibudsman organization for the New Manhattan Project. As far as I can tell, they oversee everything that has been going on, at least during the post-war production of the New Manhattan Project. LBJ's corruption was legendary. I mean, most people know this. He's the guy who benefited most from having Kennedy's head blown off, right? He became president. Who benefits? But as a young man, Johnson was called Bull Johnson because he lied so much. Reputable sources claim that Johnson would routinely take massive kickbacks and bribes for government contracts. Suitcases full of cash would routinely enter his office, the Oval Office, and any office that he occupied. One documented tale of corruption, particularly relevant to our investigation, is this story of the Dory Gold from Victorio Peak. Now, this is actually quite a well-known thing. It was in Roger Stone's book on LBJ, and there's a lot of videos online. But there's this Victorio Peak, which is it looks like a little mountain that's next to the White Sands Missile Range. And a whole bunch of gold was found in there. Now, see, this is important because the White Sands Missile Range is very heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project. This is where the Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists went. They went to Fort Bliss, and then they rotated into White Sands Missile Range, where they worked on rockets that could be used in the New Manhattan Project for meteorological purposes. So in 1937, massive amounts of gold was discovered in the caverns of this Victorio Peak. This was called Dory bars, gold Dory bars. This is like crudely refined gold. And we don't know who put it there, but there was billions of dollars worth of it. And this is, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s and stuff. So, I mean, the term billions of dollars worth of something was pretty much unheard of at that time. So, this was an incredibly massive amount of gold. Someone put it there. It wasn't naturally formed, it was made into crude bars. But anyway, by 1955, the U.S. military had wrested control of this gold from the original finders. And by 1961, the military was extracting the gold. It was quite a job because apparently there had been an accidental explosion earlier that closed one of the entrances to the caverns, and they had to bring in heavy equipment to dig it out. But the gold was flowing. Once they were able to start getting it out in 1961, the gold was flowing into the pockets of the military men who were conducting the operation. They were also conducting a cover-up. They were saying publicly that this gold didn't exist, but they were extracting it at the time. And there was a guy who I think was an executive at the White Sands Missile Range by the name of Major General John Schenkel, and he was reportedly one of the recipients of this gold. And President Kennedy and his brother Robert personally inspected the gold in mid-1963. Of course, by late 1963, he was getting his head blown off. And so, of course, Vice President Johnson knew about this. He knew about the gold. He knew about everything, believe me. Johnson wasn't missing anything. He was behind it all. I mean, this basically, you could say like every conspiracy of the time. There's Lyndon Johnson behind all of it. Don't quote me on that. But so Johnson and Texas Governor John Connally, they went about excavating the gold reportedly. And a large load of this gold was reportedly delivered to a Johnson ranch in Mexico. And it has been reported that Johnson was personally responsible for stealing most of this gold. And we have other cronies, other LBJ cronies getting in on the action. Notably, Congressman Earl Cabell reportedly was joining in on the theft of this gold. And ostensibly, to cover up his tracks, LBJ created something called the LaRue Corporation, L-A-R-U-E Corporation, which apparently had everything to do with the stealing of and laundering of this gold. Now, the implications for all of this Dory gold found in Victoria Peak, it's unclear as to what this means for the New Manhattan Project. But when you're talking about billions of dollars in unregistered gold, and it was stolen from one of the New Manhattan Project's most important sites, and it was stolen by people heavily implicated in the New Manhattan Project, it tends to raise my suspicions. So that's why I mention it here. Now, we do know that there were large-scale New Manhattan Project experiments carried out in Texas in the early 1960s. These were conducted by Vonnegut et al., these space charge experiments. And we also know that later experiments involving the dispersion of particles by aircraft and the use of atmospheric electricity were conducted in New Mexico. These were mostly carried out by the New Mexico Tech Langmuir Laboratory, and this is all in my book. But New Mexico is right next to Texas. So it's that area down there of West Texas and into New Mexico that's looking like central to where they were producing these large-scale experiments for the development of the New Manhattan Project. And the common denominator in that area apparently is this Fort Bliss, Texas. Now, Fort Bliss was the place where the Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists were first sent. I think I mentioned earlier, they would be rotated into White Sands Missile Range for working on the rockets, but their home base was in Fort Bliss. So I'm really interested in Fort Bliss. And so we're going into the conclusions here. The New Manhattan Project, the evidence indicates, has been financed by the banksters and brought into a physical existence by the American military. This is something that I established in my book. But, now we're going into more of the details of it, to the meat and potatoes. And it was largely hatched, the evidence indicates, from within the U.S. East Coast establishment. And as we know, Tesla's belongings were left in Manhattan. And Tesla is, probably the starting point of this whole thing. And, so it was mostly hatched by people in that area. And we have evidence of, here, Robert Lovett. We have the Harriman family name, we have the Bush family name, we have the Rockefeller family name, and we have a lot of associations with Skull and Bones. And so that's where it really originated with the finance guys, apparently, the East Coast establishment. And so it also makes sense that the earlier, smaller scale scientific experiments were conducted in and around Boston, Massachusetts by Vonnegut et al. Then when you needed more space to conduct larger scale development, it was taken down to Texas. Apparently, the evidence indicates, as we've seen here, that when you needed to kick it up, this was a later stage of the development of the New Manhattan Project. It was taken down to Texas for larger scale operations, and these operations were undertaken by men like Vice Admiral, the evidence indicates, were undertaken by men like Vice Admiral William Raborn, General Bernard Schriever, Teddy Wolkowitz, Bernard Vonnegut, again, he was involved in the large scale stuff too, and Gordon J.F. McDonald. Mostly in and around Texas, Texas, New Mexico, New Mexico, Texas, West Texas, New Mexico. LBJ apparently was serving as a conduit between the Eastern establishment and his fellow Texans. And this makes sense because he was apparently throwing the best parties. He had the bourbon, the beefsteak, and the blondes. So, the investigation continues. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Abstract. More episodes are always in the works, so please go to my website and sign up for my email list. My website is peterakirby.com, and also please subscribe to my Rumble channel. Thank you.